The morning sun painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and orange as Samuel McKenna stepped out of his small log cabin. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and fresh snow from the peaks above. This was his world. Now, simple, quiet, far from the chaos he had left behind. Sam was a man of 42 years, though the hard lines on his weathered face made him look older. His dark hair had started showing gray at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of honest work. To anyone who might stumble across his remote cabin near Pine Ridge, he looked like just another mountain man trying to make a living off the land, but looks could be deceiving. Every morning followed the same routine. Sam would check his traps along the mountain streams, looking for beaver, fox, and marten. The Colorado Territory in 1878 was still wild country, and fur trading remained good business for those willing to work hard and live rough. He had built his cabin in a hidden valley, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through thick stands of aspen and pine trees. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. One room with a stone fireplace, a simple bed, a wooden table, and shelves, lined with supplies. Hanging on the wall above the fireplace was a gun belt with 2 holsters. The leather was dark with age and well-worn from years of use. In those holsters rested a pair of Colt .45 revolvers, their metal dulled with time and neglect. Sam rarely looked at those guns anymore. 5 years had passed since he had hung up that gun belt and walked away from a life that had nearly destroyed his soul. 5 years since the name Samuel McKenna had struck fear into the hearts of outlaws from Texas to California. Now, the only sounds that filled his days were the whisper of wind through the trees, the splash of mountain streams, and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The townspeople of Cedar Falls, the nearest settlement about 15 miles down the mountain, knew him simply as a quiet trapper who came to trade his furs every few weeks. He would ride into town on his sturdy mountain horse, sell his pelts to the general store, buy supplies, and leave without saying much more than was necessary for business. "Strange fellow, that Sam," old Pete Wilson would say to anyone who would listen. Pete ran the general store and had been dealing with mountain men for over 20 years. Polite enough, pays his bills, but there's something about his eyes, like he's seen things that would give most men nightmares. The other townspeople had their own theories about the mysterious hermit. Some thought he was running from the law. Others believed he had lost his family in an Indian raid and couldn't bear to live among people anymore. A few of the older men suspected he might be a former soldier, one of those who came back from the war changed and broken. They were all wrong, but they were also not entirely wrong. Sam had indeed seen things that gave him nightmares. He had lived through experiences that would have broken weaker men. But he wasn't running from the law, and he hadn't lost his family to Indians. His story was both simpler and more complicated than the townsfolk imagined. The truth was that Samuel McKenna had once been the most feared gunfighter in the American West. His draw was so fast it seemed like magic to those who witnessed it. His aim was so true that men would surrender rather than face him in a fight. For 15 years, he had carved out a reputation that stretched across half the continent. He had never been an outlaw, though. Sam had always worked on the right side of the law. He had been a sheriff, a deputy marshal, and a hired gun for cattle ranchers fighting off rustlers. He had cleaned up towns that decent folks were afraid to walk through after dark. He had tracked down killers and thieves across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, but all of that had ended on a hot afternoon in a dusty town called Millerville. When everything went wrong in the space of a few terrible seconds, Sam tried not to think about Millerville. He had come to these mountains specifically to forget about Millerville and everything that had happened there. The problem was that some memories refused to stay buried, no matter how hard you tried to forget them. As he walked his trapline that morning, checking each carefully concealed snare and deadfall, Sam let his mind focus on the simple work at hand. This beaver dam had been active for several days. Fresh wood chips floated in the pond, and he could see the characteristic grooves where the animals had dragged branches to repair their home. He reset the trap carefully, using techniques an old French trapper had taught him during his first winter in the mountains. The man, Pierre Dubois, had taken pity on the obviously inexperienced newcomer and shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations of mountain men. "The beaver, he is smart," Pierre had explained in his thick accent. "You must think. Like him to catch him. You must understand his world, his needs, his fears." Sam had learned to understand more than just beavers. He had come to know every animal that lived in these mountains, from the smallest chipmunk to the largest black bear. He knew which plants were safe to eat and which streams ran clean year-round. He had learned to read weather patterns in the clouds and predict storms days before they arrived. This knowledge had kept him alive and provided him with a modest but steady income. The fur traders in Cedar Falls paid fair prices for quality pelts, and Sam's work was always top quality. He took pride in his trapping, just as he had once taken pride in his skill with a gun, but there were similarities between his old life and his new one that sometimes made him uncomfortable. Both required patience, careful observation, and the ability to predict behavior. Both demanded split-second timing and absolute precision. Both could be deadly if you made a mistake. The difference was that his old life had been about taking human lives, while his new life was about taking animal lives for survival and commerce. It was a distinction that mattered to him, even if others might not understand it. As the morning progressed, Sam worked his way along the creek that ran through the valley. He found 3 beaver in his traps and 2 pine martens. It had been a good night. The pelts would bring enough money to keep him supplied for another month, maybe longer if he was careful with his spending. He cleaned and prepared the animals with the skill of long practice, wasting nothing that could be used. The meat would provide him with meals for several days. The bones and organs would become bait for future traps. Even the fat would be rendered down for cooking and waterproofing. This was the life he had chosen. Simple, honest, and far removed from the violence and chaos of his past. He asked nothing from the world except to be left alone to live in peace among the mountains and forests he had come to love. But peace, Sam had learned, was often a temporary thing in the American West, and sometimes, no matter how far you ran, or how well you hid, the past had a way of finding you when you least expected it. As he packed up his morning's catch and prepared to head back to his cabin, Sam had no way of knowing that his quiet life was about to be shattered by men who had no respect for peace, solitude, or the rights of others to live as they chose. The Blackwood gang was riding north from New Mexico, leaving a trail of robbery, violence, and terror in their wake. And their path would soon bring them to the peaceful valley where Samuel McKenna had tried so hard to forget who he used to be. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when young Billy Carter rode his horse hard up Main Street in Cedar Falls, dust flying behind him like a brown cloud. The boy was barely 16, worked at his father's ranch 20 miles south, and had never been known to push his horse. Unless something was seriously wrong, Billy pulled up in front of the sheriff's office and practically fell off his mount, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had kept the peace in Cedar Falls for over a decade, came out to see what all the commotion was about. "Sheriff Bradley," Billy gasped, trying to catch his breath. "You need to know about this. There's a gang of men, maybe 6 or 7 of them, riding north. They hit the Riverside Bank yesterday morning, took everything and shot 2 people. The sheriff's expression grew serious. "Anyone killed?" "The bank manager's hurt bad, but he'll live. They say the gang's leader is a man named Jake Blackwood. Big fellow with a black beard and scars on his face. The folks in Riverside are scared out of their minds." Sheriff Bradley had heard the name Blackwood before. Stories drifted north from Texas and New Mexico about a family of outlaws who robbed banks and stages, rustled cattle, and weren't shy about using their guns. If the Blackwood gang was heading this way, Cedar Falls was in for serious trouble within 2 days. Those fears proved to be well-founded. The gang rode into Cedar Falls on a Thursday afternoon like they owned the place. 7 men on horseback, all armed to the teeth with rifles, pistols, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. They moved with the confidence of men who had never met anyone willing or able to stand up to them. Jake Blackwood was indeed a big man. standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders like a bull. His black beard was streaked with gray, and a long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from some long-ago fight. His eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who saw other people as either useful or obstacles to be removed. His 3 brothers rode with him. There was Frank, the youngest, at 28, who had a mean streak and a quick temper. Then came Daniel, quiet and deadly, who some said was even faster with a gun than Jake himself. The oldest brother was Robert, a man who preferred using his fist to his pistol but was equally dangerous with either. The other 3 gang members were hired guns who had thrown in with the Blackwoods for the promise of easy money and protection. They were the kind of men who drifted from one outlaw gang to another, leaving bodies and broken lives wherever they went. They made their intentions clear right from the start. Jake Blackwood walked into the First National Bank of Cedar Falls with 2 of his men while the others stayed outside to watch the street. Within 15 minutes they had cleaned out the vault and the cash drawers, making off with nearly $3,000, but that was just the beginning. The Blackwood gang didn't ride out of town after the robbery like most outlaws would have done. Instead, they took over the Lucky Dollar Saloon and announced that Cedar Falls was now under their protection. Anyone who wanted to do business in town would have to pay them a tax. Anyone who caused trouble would answer to them. Sheriff Bradley tried to organize resistance, but he was one man with a deputy who was barely out of his teens. The townspeople were merchants, farmers, and shopkeepers, not gunfighters. When the sheriff approached Jake Blackwood to demand that the gang leave town, Frank Blackwood put a bullet in the dirt at Bradley's feet and suggested he mind his own business. The message was clear. The law in Cedar Falls now came from the barrels of the Blackwood gang's guns. Within a week, the outlaws had turned the peaceful town into their personal kingdom. They demanded free meals at the restaurant, free drinks at the saloon, and free supplies from the general store. When store owner Pete Wilson hesitated to hand over a month's worth of provisions without payment, Daniel Blackwood calmly drew his pistol and shot a hole through a can of beans on the shelf behind Pete's head. "Next time I won't miss," Daniel said in his quiet voice. Pete never argued with them again. The gang members took rooms at the hotel and never paid the bill. They helped themselves to fresh horses from the livery stable whenever they felt like it. They made crude comments to the town's women and threatened anyone who objected. Cedar Falls had become a place where decent people stayed, indoors after dark and spoke in whispers during the day, but the town itself was just the beginning of the Blackwood gang's reign of terror. Once they had established their base of operations, they began extending their influence into the surrounding countryside. They robbed stagecoaches traveling the mountain roads. They rustled cattle from nearby ranches. They demanded tribute from anyone trying to do business in the area. It was only a matter of time before they discovered that the mountains around Cedar Falls were home to trappers, hunters, and prospectors who worked alone and carried whatever wealth they had with them in cash and furs. The first trapper they hit was old Joe Patterson, a man in his 60s who had been working the streams north of town for 15 years. The gang found his camp along Willow Creek and took everything he had, including his horse, his rifle, and 3 months' worth of carefully prepared pelts. When Joe tried to protest, Frank Blackwood knocked him down with the butt of his rifle and told him he was lucky they didn't just shoot him and be done with it. Word of the attack spread quickly among the mountain folk. These were people who had chosen to live away from civilization partly to avoid exactly this kind of trouble. Most of them packed up immediately and headed for safer territory, abandoning claims and trap lines they had worked for years, but a few of the more stubborn mountain men decided to stick it out, figuring they could avoid the gang by staying well off the main trails and keeping their camps hidden. It was a mistake that would cost some of them dearly. The Blackwood gang seemed to enjoy hunting the trappers almost as much as they enjoyed robbing them. They would track the mountain men to their camps, take whatever they wanted, and destroy whatever they left behind. It became a game for them, a way to relieve the boredom between more serious criminal activities. Jake Blackwood had a particular hatred for people who tried to live independently. In his mind, everyone should either be working for him or paying him tribute. The idea that some folks might think they could just mind their own business and be left alone struck him as both foolish and insulting. "Every man in this territory needs to understand who's in charge," he told his brothers one evening as they sat around a campfire, planning their next raid. "We can't have people thinking they can just hide in the mountains and ignore us. That kind of thinking spreads, and before you know it, everyone thinks they don't have to show us proper respect." The gang had taken over an abandoned ranch house, about 5 miles from Cedar Falls, using it as their headquarters when they weren't staying in town. From there, they could see for miles in every direction and spot anyone approaching long before they could be seen themselves. They had also begun recruiting local men, who were willing to work for them in exchange for protection and a share of the profits. These new gang members served as scouts and informants, keeping track of who was moving through the area and where the best opportunities for robbery might be found. As autumn deepened into winter, the Blackwood gang's control over the region became absolute. They had turned Cedar Falls into a ghost town where honest people lived in fear. They had driven most of the independent mountain folk away from their homes and livelihoods. They had made it clear that anyone who wanted to travel through their territory would have to pay for the privilege, but there was one mountain man they hadn't found yet. One trapper whose cabin was hidden so deep in the wilderness that even their scouts hadn't discovered it. One man who had been living quietly in his valley, checking his traps and tending to his simple needs, completely unaware that his peaceful world was about to collide with the violent chaos that the Blackwood gang brought wherever they went. Samuel McKenna was about to discover that no matter how far you run from trouble, sometimes trouble comes looking for you. The morning started like any other for Samuel McKenna. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside his cabin to breathe in the crisp mountain air. The first snow of winter had fallen during the night, dusting the pine trees with white and making everything look clean and fresh. Sam smiled slightly, something he rarely did anymore. Winter was his favorite season in the mountains. The world became quieter, more peaceful, and the few sounds that remained seemed sharper and more meaningful. He had no idea that 3 miles away, Frank Blackwood was studying his valley through a pair of stolen field glasses, having finally discovered the hidden trail that led to Sam's sanctuary. Sam went about his morning routine without any sense of the danger approaching. He checked the fire in his stone fireplace, adding fresh wood to keep the cabin warm. He prepared a simple breakfast of bacon, beans, and coffee, the same meal he had eaten almost every morning for the past 5 years. The coffee was strong and black, the way he liked it, brewed from beans he bought in town during his monthly supply runs. After breakfast, he gathered his equipment for the day's work. Winter trapping required different techniques than summer trapping, and Sam had spent years learning the best methods for cold weather hunting. He loaded his pack with fresh bait, replacement traps, and the tools he would need to maintain his existing trap lines. The snow made tracking easier. Sam could see exactly which animals had been moving through his territory during the night. Rabbit tracks crisscrossed the clearing around his cabin. A family of foxes had passed near the creek, their small paw prints clear in the fresh powder. Best of all, he spotted the distinctive marks of a large beaver, indicating that the dam he had been watching for weeks was still active. Sam shouldered his pack and headed out into the forest, following a route he had walked hundreds of times before. The snow crunched softly under his boots, and his breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew every tree, rock, and stream in his territory. He spent the morning checking and resetting his traps along the main creek that ran through his valley. The work was methodical and satisfying. 2 of his deadfall traps had been triggered during the night, yielding a fat marmot and a pine marten with beautiful dark fur. The marten pelt alone would bring enough money to buy supplies for a week. As he worked, Sam's mind wandered to the plans he was making for the coming winter. He needed to cut more firewood before the heavy snows came. His cabin roof could use some repairs where the wind had loosened a few shingles. He was also thinking about expanding his trap lines to include a promising area he had discovered near the ridgeline, where he had seen signs of a large family of foxes. These were the kinds of problems Sam enjoyed solving. Simple, practical challenges that required nothing more than hard work and common sense. They were so different from the life-and-death decisions that had once filled his days, back when his reputation as the fastest gun in the West made every stranger a potential threat and every conversation a possible prelude to violence. Around midday, Sam decided to check his most distant trap line, the one that followed the north fork of the creek up toward the high country. It was a longer walk, but the traps in that area often produced the best furs. The terrain was rougher too, with steep climbs and rocky passages that required careful footing, especially with snow on the ground. He was about 2 miles from his cabin when he heard the first sounds that didn't belong in his peaceful world. Horses, multiple horses, moving fast and coming from the direction of his home. Sam stopped and listened carefully, using skills he had learned during his years as a lawman. 4 horses, maybe 5, and they were definitely heading toward his valley. A cold feeling settled in Sam's stomach. In 5 years of living in these mountains, no one had ever found his cabin without him knowing about it first. The trail that led to his valley was hidden and difficult to follow. The only people who knew about it were a few of the other mountain men who had visited over the years, and none of them would approach his home without calling out first. Sam abandoned his trapline and began making his way back toward his cabin, moving as quickly as he could through the snow-covered forest. He stayed off the main trail, using game paths and rocky ground that wouldn't show his tracks. Something was wrong, and every instinct he had developed during 20 years of dangerous living was telling him to be very careful. As he got closer to his valley, he could smell wood smoke. Too much wood smoke. His cabin's fireplace produced a thin, almost invisible trail of smoke when it was working properly. What he was smelling now was the thick, choking smoke of a big fire. A fire that was burning more than just seasoned firewood. Sam crept to the edge of the tree line that surrounded his cabin and looked down into the clearing where he had built his home. What he saw made his hands clench into fists and brought back memories he had spent 5 years trying to forget. His cabin was still standing, but smoke was pouring from the open door and windows. Someone had built a large fire in his front yard, and was feeding it with everything they could find. Sam watched in growing anger as men he had never seen before threw his carefully prepared winter furs onto the flames. Months of work, hundreds of dollars worth of pelts, disappearing into smoke and ash. There were 5 men total, all of them armed and moving around his property like they owned it. Sam could see his 2 horses tied to a tree near the creek, loaded down with supplies that had been stolen from his cabin. The men were laughing and joking as they destroyed his life's work, treating the whole thing like it was some kind of game. The leader of the group was a young man with sandy hair and a cruel face. He was holding one of Sam's best beaver pelts, examining it with the eye of someone who knew quality when he saw it. Instead of adding it to the fire, he rolled it up and tied it to his saddle. "Not bad work for a crazy old hermit," the young man said to his companions. "This pelt's worth at least $20 in the right market." "What about the cabin, Frank?" asked one of the other men. "Should we burn it down too?" Frank Blackwood, for that's who the sandy-haired leader was, considered the question for a moment. "Nah, leave it. Might be useful if we need a place to hole up during a storm. Besides, I want the old man to see what happens when people don't." Show proper respect to the Blackwood gang. Sam watched from his hiding place as Frank pulled out a piece of paper and began writing something on it with a pencil stub. When he finished, he used his knife to pin the note to the cabin door. "Let's get out of here," Frank said. "We've got what we came for, and I want to be back at the ranch before dark." The 5 men mounted their horses and rode out of the valley, driving Sam's stolen horses ahead of them. They left behind a scene of complete destruction. The fire was still burning, consuming the last of Sam's furs. His supplies were scattered around the clearing, most of them ruined. His traps had been broken and thrown aside. Even his carefully maintained garden plot had been torn up, just for the sake of causing damage. When Sam was certain the men were gone, he walked down to his cabin on legs that felt strangely unsteady. The building itself was mostly undamaged, but the inside had been ransacked. His furniture was overturned, his food supplies were scattered across the floor, and everything that couldn't be stolen had been deliberately destroyed. But it was the note pinned to his door that made something dark and cold awaken inside Samuel McKenna's chest. The handwriting was crude, but the message was clear. Thanks for the donation, old man. Next time we might take more than your furs. The Blackwood gang always collects what's owed. Sam stared at those words for a long time, feeling something he hadn't felt in 5 years. It started as a burning sensation in his stomach and slowly spread through his entire body. It was rage. Pure, cold rage of the kind that had once made him the most feared gunfighter in the American West. He walked slowly to the stone fireplace, where his gun belt hung on its wooden peg. The leather was still supple despite years of neglect, and the weight of the Colt .45 revolvers felt familiar in his hands. Muscle memory took over as he checked the weapons, spinning the cylinders and testing the action. Everything was still. In perfect working order, Samuel McKenna, the quiet mountain hermit, was gone. In his place stood a man who had once made his living with those guns, a man who had cleaned up towns that decent people were afraid to enter, a man who had never lost a gunfight in 20 years of dangerous living the Blackwood gang had made. The worst mistake of their criminal careers. They had awakened a sleeping Wolf, and now they were going to discover why some men were better left alone. Sam sat on the wooden chair beside his fireplace, the gun belt heavy across his lap. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the fire he had rebuilt and the occasional settling of the log walls. Outside, darkness had fallen over the mountains, bringing with it the kind of deep silence that only exists in the wilderness. But inside Sam's mind, the silence was broken by voices from the past. The weight of the Colt .45 in his hands brought back memories he had spent 5 years trying to bury. His fingers traced the familiar grooves in the wooden grips, remembering the countless hours he had spent practicing his draw, perfecting the motion until it became as natural as breathing. The guns felt strange after so long, but they also felt like coming home. He had been 19 years old when he first strapped on a gun belt, just a farm boy from Kansas who thought he understood what it meant to be a man. That was before he learned that killing, even when it was legal and necessary, left marks on a person's soul that never fully healed. His first gunfight had been in a town called Prescott, Arizona Territory. Sam had been working as a deputy sheriff for exactly 3 weeks when a drunk cowboy decided to take his anger out on the local saloon girls. The man had been hitting one of the women when Sam tried to intervene. Things escalated quickly, as they often did in those days, and suddenly both men were standing in the dusty street with their hands hovering over their guns. Sam had been terrified, but his hand had moved without conscious thought. The cowboy's gun was barely clear of its holster when Sam's bullet took him down. It was over in seconds, but the image of that man falling stayed with Sam for months afterward. He used to wake up in cold sweats, replaying the moment over and over in his mind, but time and necessity had gradually worn away his sensitivity to violence. Each gunfight became easier than the last. Each dead man became just another problem solved, another threat eliminated. By the time he was 25, Samuel McKenna had killed 17 men in fair fights, and his reputation had begun to spread across the frontier. The strange thing was that he had never enjoyed the killing. Some gunfighters seemed to thrive on the fear and respect their reputations brought them. Sam had always seen his skill with a gun as simply a tool, like a carpenter's hammer or a blacksmith's anvil. It was something he was good at, something that helped him make a living and keep the peace in wild places where the law was often just a word on paper. For 15 years, he had worked as a lawman in towns that needed someone willing to face down killers and thieves. He had tracked outlaws across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. He had stood alone against gangs of armed men and somehow always walked away alive. The newspapers had started calling him the fastest gun in the West, and for once, the newspapers weren't exaggerating, but success in his profession had come with a price, and that went beyond the physical scars and the sleepless nights. Sam had gradually become isolated from normal human relationships. Most people were either afraid of him or wanted to use his reputation for their own purposes. Women saw him as either a dangerous man to avoid or an exciting challenge to tame. Men either treated him with fearful respect or tried to prove themselves by calling him out. By the time he reached his mid-30s, Sam had begun to wonder if there was more to life than living by the gun. He had saved enough money to buy a small ranch or maybe start a business in some peaceful town where nobody knew his name. He had started to dream about a different kind of future, one where he could wake up in the morning without automatically checking to make sure his guns were within reach. Then came Millerville, and everything changed. Sam closed his eyes and let himself remember that terrible day 5 years ago. He had been working as a federal marshal then, tracking a gang of bank robbers who had been terrorizing small towns across Colorado and Wyoming. The trail had led him to Millerville, a quiet farming community that seemed about as far from violence as any place on earth. He had found the gang's hideout in an abandoned mine shaft about 2 miles from town. There were 4 of them, all wanted men with prices on their heads. Sam had given them the chance to surrender, as was his custom, but they had chosen to fight instead. The gunfight had been short and decisive. All 4 outlaws were dead within minutes, but as Sam was checking the bodies, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, gun in hand, expecting to find another gang member who had been hiding in the mine. Instead, he found himself facing a boy. Just a kid, maybe 12 years old, who had apparently followed him to the mine out of curiosity. The boy's eyes went wide with terror when he saw Sam's drawn gun. In that moment of fear, he did what any frightened child might do. He turned and ran. But in his panic, he stumbled and fell, tumbling down a steep slope beside the mine entrance. Sam had holstered his gun immediately and rushed to help the boy. But it was too late. The child had struck his head on a sharp rock during the fall. He died in Sam's arms, never regaining consciousness, while Sam desperately tried to stop the bleeding and calling for help that would never come. The boy's name had been Timothy Walsh. He was the youngest son of the local blacksmith, a curious and adventurous child who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sam had carried the boy's body back to town and tried to explain to the heartbroken parents what had happened. The townspeople didn't blame Sam directly. Everyone understood that it had been a terrible accident, that Sam had been doing his job, and the boy had been where he shouldn't have been. But Sam blamed himself. If he hadn't drawn his gun so quickly, if he had been more careful about who might be watching, if he had checked the area before starting the gunfight, Timothy Walsh would still be alive. The boy's death had shattered something inside Sam that he hadn't even known was still whole. For weeks afterward, he found himself unable to draw his gun without seeing Timothy's terrified face. He would wake up at night hearing the sound of the boy's last breath. He stopped eating regularly and lost weight. His hands, which had always been rock steady, developed a slight tremor. Sam had tried to continue working as a marshal, but his heart was no longer in it. Every time he faced a dangerous situation, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, thinking about unintended consequences and innocent bystanders. In a profession where a moment's hesitation could mean the difference between life and death, that kind of doubt was deadly. After 3 more months of trying to do his job while fighting the ghosts in his head, Sam had finally accepted the truth. Samuel McKenna, the fastest gun in the West, was finished. He had turned in his badge, sold his horse and most of his possessions, and disappeared into the Rocky Mountains to find a new way to live. For 5 years, the mountains had given him peace. The simple work of trapping and trading had slowly healed the worst of his psychological wounds. He had learned to sleep through the night without nightmares. He had found satisfaction in honest work that didn't require him to point a gun at another human being. But now, sitting in his ransacked cabin with his guns in his lap, Sam could feel the old anger returning. The Blackwood gang had violated more than just his property. They had destroyed the sanctuary he had built for his damaged soul. They had taken away the peaceful life he had worked so hard to create, and worse than that, they were threatening other people. Other trappers, other mountain folk who just wanted to be left alone to live their lives in peace. Sam thought about old Joe Patterson, beaten down and robbed of everything he owned. He thought about the terrified townspeople in Cedar Falls. Too afraid to stand up to the gang's reign of terror, Timothy Walsh was still dead, and that would never change. But maybe, just maybe, Sam could prevent other innocent people from suffering at the hands of men who thought their guns gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. Sam stood up slowly and walked to the mirror that hung beside his wash basin. The face that looked back at him was older than the one that had once struck fear into the hearts of outlaws across the frontier. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, his eyes deeper and sadder. But underneath the changes, he could still see traces of the man he used to be. The fastest gun in the West was about to ride again. The morning sun was just breaking over the mountain peaks when Sam began the ritual he hadn't performed in 5 years. He laid out his gun belt on the wooden table and examined every piece of leather, every metal fitting, every stitch and rivet. The holsters were still in perfect condition, darkened with age but supple and smooth. The belt itself showed no signs of cracking or weakness, despite years of hanging unused on the cabin wall. Next came the guns themselves. Sam lifted the first Colt .45 and began the careful process of cleaning and inspection that had once been as much a part of his daily routine as eating breakfast. He disassembled the weapon with practiced ease, his hands remembering motions they hadn't made in half a decade. Every spring, every screw, every moving part was examined and cleaned until the gun gleamed like new. The second revolver received the same careful attention. Sam had always maintained both weapons in identical condition, knowing that his life might one day depend on either gun working perfectly when called upon. As he worked, muscle memory took over. His fingers moved with the confidence of long experience, finding and correcting tiny flaws that most men would never notice. When both guns were clean and properly oiled, Sam began loading them. He had kept a supply of ammunition in a sealed box, protected from moisture and temperature changes. Each cartridge was inspected before being placed in the cylinder. 6 rounds in each gun, 12 chances to stay alive in whatever confrontation was coming, but cleaning and loading the weapons was only the beginning. Sam stepped outside into the crisp morning air and walked to a clearing behind his cabin where he had sometimes practiced with a rifle during his years as a hermit. Today, it would serve a different purpose. He set up targets using pieces of wood from his damaged supplies, placing them at various distances from 15 to 50 feet. Then he stepped back, took a deep breath, and reached for his right-hand gun. The first draw was clumsy and slow. Sam's hand bumped against the holster, and the gun caught for a moment before clearing leather. It had been too long. The lightning fast. Reflexes that had once made him legendary had been dulled by years of peaceful living, but the fundamentals were still there, buried beneath the rust of disuse. Sam spent the next hour practicing the basic draw over and over again, until his hand began to remember the precise angle and motion required. Gradually, the movement became smoother, more natural. When he was satisfied with his draw, Sam began working on his aim. The first shot went wide, missing the closest target completely. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the surrounding mountains, seeming impossibly loud after so many years of silence. Sam frowned and adjusted his stance, remembering lessons learned decades ago about breathing, sight alignment, and trigger control. The second shot hit the target, though not where he had been aiming. The third was closer. By the 10th shot, Sam was hitting what he aimed at with something approaching his old accuracy. By the 20th, he was placing bullets exactly where he wanted them, even at the longer distances, but accuracy alone wouldn't be enough if he was going to face the Blackwood gang. In a real gunfight, speed mattered more than precision. A man who could draw and fire quickly enough to get the first shot usually won, even if that shot wasn't perfectly placed. Sam holstered both guns and prepared to practice the thing that had made him famous across the frontier, the fast draw. The lightning-quick motion that could mean the difference between life and death when facing armed opponents. He started slowly, concentrating on smoothness rather than speed. Draw, aim, fire, holster the gun, and repeat. Each repetition was slightly faster than the last, but Sam forced himself to maintain control. A fast draw that resulted in a missed shot was worse than useless. As the morning progressed, Sam felt the old skills returning. His hand found the gun grip without conscious thought. The weapon cleared the holster in a smooth, practiced motion. His thumb cocked the hammer as the barrel came level. His finger found the trigger at exactly the right moment. By noon, Sam was drawing and firing in well under a second. Not as fast as he had been in his prime, but fast enough to handle most opponents. The targets he had set up were riddled with bullet holes, testament to hours of concentrated practice, but there was more to prepare than just his shooting skills. Sam went back into his cabin and found the clothes he had worn during his years as a lawman. Black pants, white shirt, black vest, and a long coat that had been tailored to accommodate his gun belt. The clothes still fit, though they hung a bit loose on his frame after years of simple mountain living. Looking at himself in the mirror, Sam saw a different man than the hermit who had been checking trap lines just 2 days ago. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it was well underway. The quiet mountain man was fading, and in his place was emerging someone harder, more dangerous. Sam saddled the old mule he used for trips to town, the only mount he had left after the gang stole his horses. The animal wasn't much to look at. Brown and stubborn and past its prime, but it was sure-footed on mountain trails, and had never failed to get him where he needed to go. The ride to Cedar Falls took most of the afternoon. Sam kept to the back trails, avoiding the main roads where he might encounter gang members or their scouts. He wanted his arrival in town to be a surprise, at least until he was ready to make his presence known. As he approached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Sam could see that the place had changed since his last visit. The streets were nearly empty despite the early evening hour when people should have been finishing their daily business. Most of the shops had their shutters closed, and the few people he could see moved quickly and kept their heads down. The Lucky Dollar Saloon, however, was brightly lit and full of noise. Loud voices, laughter, and the sound of breaking glass carried clearly through the evening air. Sam could see horses tied up outside, including 2 that looked familiar. They were his own stolen mounts, now bearing different saddles and equipment. Sam tied his mule to a post near the general store and walked slowly toward the saloon. He moved with deliberate casualness, looking like just another mountain man come to town for supplies and maybe a drink. But underneath his relaxed exterior, every nerve was alert and ready. As he got closer to the saloon, Sam could hear voices more clearly. Through the batwing doors, he could see several men gathered around a table, playing cards and drinking heavily. One of them was a young man with sandy hair who matched the description he had formed of Frank Blackwood. The man was wearing a new fur hat that Sam recognized as having been made from one of his own pelts. Sam pushed through the doors and stepped into the saloon. The noise level dropped noticeably as the patrons noticed the newcomer. Sam walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey, paying with coins from his pocket. The bartender, a nervous-looking man named Charlie, served the drink with shaking hands. "You boys seem to be having a good time," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the card table where Frank Blackwood was sitting. Frank looked up from his cards, taking in Sam's weathered appearance and simple clothes. The young outlaw's lips curved in a cruel smile. "Well, look what we have here," Frank said loudly. "Another crazy old mountain man come to town. You hear that, boys? We got ourselves another hermit who thinks he can just walk in here and drink with civilized folks." The other men at the table laughed, but there was something nervous about the sound. Something about the quiet stranger didn't seem quite right, though none of them could put their finger on what was bothering them. Sam turned slowly to face the table, his whiskey glass still in his left hand. His right hand hung loose at his side, only inches from the grip of his gun. "I believe you boys have something that belongs to me," Sam said, his voice calm and level. "2 horses, some supplies, and about 3 months' worth of furs. I'd like them back." The laughter from the card table died away completely. Frank Blackwood's smile faded as he realized this wasn't going to be another easy victim to intimidate. "You got some nerve, old man," Frank said, his hand moving toward his own gun. "Making demands of the Blackwood gang, maybe you need to learn some respect." Sam set his whiskey glass on the bar without taking his eyes off Frank Blackwood. The movement was deliberate and final, like a man removing his hat before a fight. "The name's Samuel McKenna," Sam said quietly, "and I think it's time you boys learned what real respect looks like." The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Every man in the saloon who was old enough to remember the stories from the frontier wars knew that name, Samuel McKenna. The fastest gun in the West, the man who had never lost a gunfight. In 20 years of dangerous living, Frank Blackwood's face went pale as he realized he was no longer facing a helpless mountain hermit. He was looking at a legend. And that legend was waiting for him to make the next move. The silence in the Lucky Dollar Saloon stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Every man in the room understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Samuel McKenna, the legendary gunfighter who had vanished 5 years ago, was standing 10 feet away from Frank Blackwood, and both men had their hands near their guns. Frank's mind was racing as he tried to process what was happening. He had heard the stories about McKenna, of course. Every man who lived by the gun in the American West knew those stories. McKenna was supposed to be dead or retired or disappeared forever into some distant territory. He wasn't supposed to be standing in a saloon in Cedar Falls, looking like he was ready to settle old scores, but there was no mistaking the quiet confidence in the older man's posture, or the way his right hand hung just inches from his gun grip. This was either Samuel McKenna himself, or someone who had learned to imitate the legend perfectly. Either way, Frank was in serious trouble. The other patrons in the saloon began backing away from the confrontation, creating a clear space around the two men. Charlie the bartender ducked behind his bar, taking his bottles of expensive whiskey with him. The local townspeople, who had been forced to share the saloon with the gang members, pressed themselves against the walls, not wanting to miss the show, but terrified of being caught in the crossfire. Frank's two companions at the card table were trying to decide whether to back up their friend or get out of the way. They were hired guns, men who had thrown in with the Blackwood gang for easy money and protection. Neither of them had signed up to face down a living legend in a gunfight. "You're bluffing," Frank said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. "Samuel McKenna disappeared years ago. You're just some crazy old fool trying to scare us with a famous name." Sam's expression didn't change. He stood perfectly still, his breathing slow and steady, his eyes never leaving Frank's face. When he spoke, his voice was as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "Your brother Jake and the rest of your gang aren't here to help you," Sam said quietly. "It's just you and your friends against one old mountain man. Should be easy enough, if you're half as tough as you pretend to be." Frank glanced quickly at his companions, seeing uncertainty in their faces. These men were bullies and thieves, used to intimidating shopkeepers and farmers. They weren't accustomed to facing someone who showed no fear, someone who seemed almost eager for the fight to begin. "Last chance," Sam continued, his hand still motionless at his side. "Return what you stole from me, ride out of this territory, and never come back, or we can settle this the hard way." Frank's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of witnesses. The Blackwood gang's reputation was built on the idea that they were the toughest, meanest men in the territory. If word got out that Frank Blackwood had been scared off by one old man, that reputation would be destroyed. "The hard way it is," Frank snarled, and his hand dropped toward his gun. What happened next would be remembered and retold in Cedar Falls for the next 50 years. Frank Blackwood was no amateur with a pistol. He had killed 6 men in gunfights and wounded a dozen more. His draw was smooth and practiced, honed by years of violent living. Under normal circumstances, he could clear leather and fire in just over a second, but these weren't normal circumstances. And Samuel McKenna wasn't a normal opponent. Sam's hand moved like striking lightning. One moment it was hanging loose at his side, and the next it held a cocked Colt .45 that was pointed directly at Frank's chest. The movement was so fast that several witnesses later claimed they never actually saw the draw happen. They just heard the thunder of gunfire and saw Frank Blackwood stumbling backward with a look of shock and disbelief on his face. Frank's gun was only halfway out of its holster when Sam's bullet took him. He managed to get off one wild shot that buried itself in the saloon's wooden floor, but by then he was already falling. He hit the ground hard and didn't move again. The two hired guns who had been sitting with Frank reacted with the desperate speed of men who knew they were next. Both went for their weapons at the same time, hoping that together they might have a chance against the legendary gunfighter. They were wrong. Sam's left hand found his second gun with the same lightning speed as his right had found the first. Now he held both Colts, and they spoke almost simultaneously. The hired gun on the left caught a bullet in the shoulder that spun him around and sent him crashing into a table. The man on the right took a shot to the chest and dropped where he stood. The entire gunfight had lasted less than 5 seconds. 3 armed men had tried to kill Samuel McKenna, and all 3 were down. Sam stood in the middle of the saloon, smoke curling from the barrels of his guns, looking as calm as if he had just finished his evening coffee. The wounded hired gun was still alive, clutching his shoulder and moaning in pain. Sam walked over to him and looked down with eyes that showed no mercy. "You've got 2 choices," Sam said quietly. "You can get on a horse and ride out of this territory, or you can join your friends on the floor. What's it going to be?" The wounded man didn't need to think about his answer. "I'm leaving," he gasped. "I'm leaving right now and never coming back." "Smart choice," Sam replied. He helped the man to his feet and guided him toward the door. "Tell Jake Blackwood and the rest of his gang that Samuel McKenna is back. Tell them what happened here. And tell them that if they're smart, they'll be gone by sunrise." The hired gun stumbled out of the saloon, holding his wounded shoulder and looking back over his shoulder as if he expected Sam to shoot him in the back. But Sam had already holstered his guns and was examining the bodies of the men he had killed. Frank Blackwood looked younger in death than he had in life. Without the cruel expression that had usually twisted his features, he might have been mistaken for someone's son or brother. For a moment, Sam felt the familiar weight of regret that always followed violence, even when that violence was necessary and justified, but this time was different. This time, Sam had acted not out of anger or revenge, but to protect innocent people who couldn't protect themselves. The guilt that had haunted him since Timothy Walsh's death was still there, but it was balanced now by the knowledge that some evils had to be faced, regardless of the personal cost. The townspeople began emerging from their hiding places, staring at Sam with a mixture of awe and fear. Word of the gunfight would spread quickly, and by morning everyone in the territory would know that the legendary Samuel McKenna had returned. Charlie the bartender peeked over his bar, surveying the damage to his establishment. 3 dead men, bullet holes in the floor and walls, and overturned furniture. But for the first time in weeks, the Lucky Dollar Saloon was free of the Blackwood gang's oppressive presence. "Drinks are on the house," Charlie announced shakily, "for anyone brave enough to drink with a legend." Sam picked up the whiskey glass he had set on the bar before the fight began. The liquor was still there, undisturbed despite the violence that had erupted around it. He drained the glass in one swallow and set it back down. "I'll be needing my horses back," Sam said quietly, "and anything else that was stolen from my cabin." "Yes, sir, Mr. McKenna," Charlie replied quickly. "Whatever you need. The whole town owes you a debt for what you did here tonight." Sam nodded and walked toward the door, stepping carefully around the bodies on the floor. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back at the people gathered in the saloon. "The fight's not over yet," he said. "Jake Blackwood and his brothers are still out there, and they won't take kindly to what happened here. You folks might want to stay indoors for the next few days." And then he was gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost from the old frontier days. Behind him, the people of Cedar Falls began to hope that maybe, just maybe, their long nightmare was finally coming to an end. The wounded hired gun rode his horse like the devil himself was chasing him. His shoulder throbbed with every step the animal took, but he didn't dare slow down until he reached the abandoned ranch house where Jake Blackwood and his remaining gang members had made their headquarters. Blood had soaked through his shirt, and his face was pale with shock and pain, but he was alive, which was more than he could say for his companions. Jake Blackwood was sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, cleaning his rifle and enjoying the cool evening air, when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The horse was moving fast, too fast for a casual ride. And Jake's instincts told him something was wrong even before he could see the rider clearly. When the wounded man finally came into view, slumped over his horse's neck and barely staying in the saddle, Jake knew his worst fears had come true. Something had gone seriously wrong in Cedar Falls. "What happened to you?" Jake demanded, jumping up from his chair and grabbing the horse's bridle as the wounded man nearly fell from the saddle. "Frank's dead," the hired gun gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Tommy's dead too. And old Pete, all of them dead, shot down in the saloon." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. His youngest brother Frank had been reckless and hot-tempered, but he was also fast with a gun and smart enough to avoid obvious traps. For all three men to be killed, they must have run into serious trouble. Who did it? Jake growled, his hands clenching into fists. Was it the law? Did they bring in federal marshals? The wounded man shook his head weakly. Worse than that. Jake, it was Samuel McKenna, the real Samuel McKenna. He's back and he's hunting us? For a moment, Jake thought he had misheard. Samuel McKenna was a name from the past, a legend from the old days when the frontier was even wilder than it was now. McKenna had disappeared years ago, and most people assumed he was dead or had retired to some distant place where nobody would know his name. "You're out of your head," Jake said roughly. "McKenna's been gone for years. It was probably just some local gunslinger using his name to scare you." "I saw him draw," the wounded man insisted, his voice shaking with remembered fear. "I've never seen anything like it in my life. Frank never even got his gun clear of the holster. It was over in seconds, Jake, all of them, dead in seconds." Jake studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception or delirium from his wound. But there was nothing but stark terror in the hired gun's eyes, the kind of fear that couldn't be faked. Daniel Blackwood emerged from the ranch house, having heard the commotion. Jake's middle brother was the quietest of the Blackwood clan, but also the most dangerous when roused to anger. His pale blue eyes took in the wounded man's condition and the blood-soaked shirt. "Frank?" Daniel asked simply. "Dead," Jake replied. Grimly, "Along with Tommy and Pete, this fellow claims it was Samuel McKenna who killed them." Daniel's expression didn't change, but his hand moved instinctively to the grip of his pistol. Unlike Jake, Daniel was old enough to remember some of the stories about McKenna from his own experience. He had seen the legendary gunfighter in action once, 15 years ago in a town called Silver Creek, and he had never forgotten the deadly grace with which the man moved. "If it really is McKenna, we're in trouble," Daniel said quietly. "That man's killed more gunfighters than the rest of us combined." Robert Blackwood, the oldest of the three remaining brothers, came around the corner of the house carrying a bucket of water from the well. He was a big man, even larger than Jake, with hands like ham hocks and a temperament to match. Robert preferred to settle his disputes with his fists rather than his gun, but he was deadly with either. "What's all the shouting about?" Robert demanded, setting down the bucket and wiping his hands on his pants. Jake quickly explained what the wounded hired gun had told them. Robert's face grew darker with each detail, and by the time Jake finished talking, the big man's hands were clenched into fists that could have crushed rocks. "I don't care if it's McKenna or the ghost of Wild. Bill Hickok," Robert snarled. "Nobody kills a Blackwood and lives to brag about it. We're going to ride into town and burn the whole place down." "Hold on," Daniel said calmly. "If this really is Samuel McKenna, we need to think this through. The man didn't get his reputation by accident. He survived 20 years of gunfights. Because he's smarter than his enemies, not just faster." Jake was torn between his desire for immediate revenge and his practical understanding that Daniel was right. The Blackwood gang had built their reputation by being more ruthless and better organized than their opponents. They didn't survive by charging into obvious traps or letting their emotions override their judgment, but Frank had been his youngest brother, the baby of the family, and the thought of him lying dead in some saloon floor made Jake's vision blur with rage. "We can't let this stand," Jake said through gritted teeth. "If word gets out that someone killed a Blackwood and we didn't do anything about it, every two-bit gunslinger in the territory will think they can take us on." "Nobody's saying we don't do anything about it," Daniel replied. "I'm saying we do it smart. McKenna's just one man, no matter how fast he is. We've got numbers, and we know this territory better than he does. The wounded hired gun, who had been listening to this conversation while trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder wound, finally spoke up. "There's something else you need to know," he said weakly. "Before I left town, I heard people talking. The whole place was buzzing with the news. Word's already spreading to the other towns, the ranches, everywhere. People are saying that Samuel McKenna is back and that he's going to clean up the territory." Jake cursed under his breath. In the space of one evening, everything had changed. The Blackwood gang had gone from being the undisputed rulers of their territory to being hunted men. Other outlaws would be watching to see how they handled this challenge. Lawmen who had been afraid to act against them might suddenly find their courage. Worst of all, the ordinary people who had been cowed into submission might start to believe that they could fight back. "We need to end this quick," Jake decided, "before it gets any worse. Daniel, you know McKenna better than the rest of us. What's his weakness?" Daniel thought for a moment, remembering everything he had heard about the legendary gunfighter over the years. McKenna had always worked alone, had always tried to minimize innocent casualties, and had always given his opponents a chance to surrender before resorting to violence. "He's got a conscience," Daniel said finally. "That's what made him retire. In the first place, from what I heard, something about a kid getting killed by accident. If we can put him in a position where innocent people might get hurt, it might throw him off his game." Robert cracked his knuckles loudly, "So we use the townspeople as shields. Make him come to us where we can control the situation." "Exactly," Jake agreed. "We go back to Cedar Falls, but this time we're ready for him. We take hostages, fortify ourselves in the bank or the hotel, and force him to come to us on our terms." The plan was brutal and simple, the kind of strategy that had served the Blackwood gang well in the past. But as they prepared their weapons and saddled their horses for the ride back to town, none of them realized that they were about to face an opponent who had spent 5 years thinking about the mistakes he had made, the innocents who had suffered. Because of his actions and the best ways to ensure that such tragedies never happened again, Samuel McKenna was no longer the same man who had retired to the mountains in guilt and sorrow. He had become something more dangerous than a fast gun or a skilled fighter. He had become a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As the Blackwood brothers rode toward their final confrontation, the legends of the Old West were about to collide in a way that would determine not just who lived and who died, but what kind of place the American frontier would become for the people who called it home. The morning after the saloon gunfight, Samuel McKenna sat on the porch of the hotel in Cedar Falls, watching the sun rise over the mountains he had called home for 5 years. The town was slowly coming to life around him, but there was a different feeling in the air. People walked with their heads held higher. Shopkeepers opened their doors without fear. Children played in the streets instead of hiding indoors, but Sam knew the peace was temporary. Jake Blackwood and his remaining gang. Members were still out there, and men like that didn't forget or forgive when their family was killed. They would be back, probably before the day was over, and when they came, they would be ready for a fight. Sheriff Bradley approached the hotel, his badge freshly polished, and his gun belt buckled tight around his waist. The lawman looked 10 years younger than he had just yesterday, as if the return of hope to his town had given him back his strength and courage. "Morning, Mr. McKenna," the sheriff said, tipping his hat respectfully. "I wanted to thank you for what you did last night. This town's been living in fear for too long." Sam nodded but didn't smile. "It's not over yet, Sheriff. Jake Blackwood won't let his brother's death go unanswered. He'll be coming for me, and when he does, he won't be particular about who gets hurt in the process." "Then we'll be ready for him," Bradley replied with more confidence than he had shown in weeks. "The whole town's behind you, Mr. McKenna. We're not going to let those outlaws terrorize us anymore." Sam studied the sheriff's face, seeing the determination there but also understanding the reality of what they were facing. Bradley was a good man and a decent lawman, but he wasn't a gunfighter. Neither were the townspeople who had suffered under the Blackwood gang's reign of terror. They were shopkeepers, farmers, and working folks who had never asked for this kind of trouble. "I appreciate the support, Sheriff," Sam said quietly, "but this is my fight. When Jake Blackwood comes to town, I want you to make sure all the innocent people are somewhere safe. Lock them in the church, the school, anywhere with solid walls and only one way in. Then you and your deputy stay with them." Bradley started to protest, but Sam held up a hand to stop him. "I know you want to help," Sam continued. "But the best way you can help is by making sure no innocent people get caught in the crossfire. I've seen too many good people hurt because they were in the wrong place when the shooting started." The sheriff reluctantly agreed, understanding that Sam was speaking from painful experience. As Bradley walked away to organize the townspeople, Sam continued his vigil on the hotel porch, waiting for the confrontation he knew was coming. He didn't have to wait long. Around noon, a rider came thundering into town from the north, his horse lathered with sweat and his eyes wild with fear. It was one of the local ranchers, a man named Wilson, who lived about 10 miles outside of Cedar Falls. "They're coming," Wilson shouted as he pulled up in front of the hotel. "The Blackwood gang, all of them, riding hard toward town. They'll be here within the hour." Sam stood up slowly, checking his guns one final time. The weight of the Colts on his hips felt familiar and reassuring, like old friends returning after a long absence. "How many?" Sam asked. "I counted 5 men," Wilson replied, breathing hard. "The 3 Blackwood brothers and 2 others I didn't recognize. They looked mean, Mr. McKenna, real mean." Sam nodded. 5 against 1 weren't the worst odds he had ever faced, but they weren't the best either. More importantly, Jake Blackwood would be planning something beyond a simple gunfight. In the street, the man was too smart to face Sam on equal terms if he could help it. Sheriff Bradley appeared at Sam's side, having heard the rancher's warning. "What do you want us to do?" "Get everyone inside and keep them there," Sam replied. "Board up the windows if you have to, and Sheriff, whatever you hear happening out here, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." As the townspeople hurried to find shelter, Sam walked slowly down Main Street toward the edge of town. He wanted to meet the Blackwood gang as far from innocent people as possible. The street was empty now except for Sam, his footsteps echoing off the wooden sidewalks. The Blackwood brothers arrived exactly as Wilson had described them. 5 riders came into view at the far end of Main Street, moving at a steady walk that spoke of confidence and deadly purpose. Jake Blackwood rode in the center, flanked by his brothers Daniel and Robert. The 2 hired guns brought up the rear. Looking nervous but determined, they stopped about 50 yards away from Sam, close enough to talk but far enough apart to avoid any surprise moves. Jake Blackwood dismounted and stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun grip. "Samuel McKenna," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You killed my brother. Now I'm going to kill you." Sam remained perfectly still, his own hands hanging loose at his sides. "Your brother made his choice when he decided to rob and terrorize innocent people. I gave him a chance to walk away." "Well, I'm not walking away," Jake snarled. "But I'm not stupid enough to face you in a fair fight either." Boys spread out. The 5 men began to fan out across the width of the street, trying to force Sam to divide his attention between multiple targets. It was a smart tactic, the kind of strategy that had kept the Blackwood gang alive and successful for years, but Sam had fought outnumbered before, and he had learned a few things about survival during his 20 years as a lawman. "Last chance," Sam said calmly. "Ride out now and I'll let you live." Jake Blackwood's answer was to draw his gun. What followed was the most legendary gunfight in the history of Cedar Falls, witnessed by a dozen people who watched through windows and cracks. Indoors, Sam moved like a force of nature, his hands finding his guns with impossible speed. The first shot dropped Jake Blackwood before the outlaw leader's weapon was fully drawn. The second shot took down Daniel, who was fast but not fast enough, Robert. Blackwood, the biggest and strongest of the brothers, managed to get off a shot that whistled past Sam's head. Sam's return fire was more accurate, sending the big man crashing to the ground like a felled tree. The 2 hired guns, Seeing their employers dead or dying tried to retreat to their horses, Sam let them go. He had seen enough killing for one day, and these men weren't the real threat. They were just followers who would scatter to the winds now that their leaders were gone. The gunfight had lasted less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, all three Blackwood brothers lay motionless in the dusty street. The reign of terror that had gripped the territory for months was finally over. Sheriff Bradley was the first to emerge from hiding, followed slowly by the townspeople who had been watching from windows and doorways. They gathered around Sam with expressions of awe and gratitude, but Sam felt no satisfaction in the victory. 3 more men were dead, adding to the long list of graves that marked his passage through life. "Is it over?" asked Charlie the bartender, looking down at the bodies with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "It's over," Sam confirmed quietly. "The Blackwood gang is finished." The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. The people of Cedar Falls treated Sam like a hero, buying him drinks and meals, offering him money and land, begging him to stay and become their permanent sheriff. But Sam knew he couldn't stay. He had never been able to stay anywhere for long once his reputation caught up with him. As the celebrations continued around him, Sam quietly slipped away from the crowd and walked to the livery stable where his recovered horses were waiting. He had retrieved his stolen property, settled his score with the Blackwood gang, and freed an entire territory from the grip of fear. It was time to move on. Some folks said they saw him riding south toward New Mexico that night, his pack loaded with supplies for a long journey. Others claimed he headed west toward California, chasing rumors of gold strikes in the Sierra Nevada mountains. A few insisted he had gone north into Canada, seeking a place where no one would ever hear the name Samuel McKenna. The truth was that nobody really knew where he went. Sam had simply vanished into the vast wilderness of the American West, leaving behind only stories and legends that would grow larger with each telling. But in the quiet mountain valley where he had once found peace, a new cabin appeared within a year, built in a hidden spot that could only be reached by following game trails known to few. Local trappers occasionally reported seeing smoke from a distant chimney, or finding expertly set traps that yielded the finest furs anyone had ever seen. The people of Cedar Falls never forgot the quiet man who had saved their town and then disappeared into legend. Every year on the anniversary of the great gunfight, they would raise a toast to Samuel McKenna, wherever he might be. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the mountain air was clear, they thought they could hear the distant sound of a man chopping wood or calling to his horses. Samuel McKenna had learned that some men could never fully escape their past, but they could choose how to live with it. He had chosen to use his deadly skills one last time to protect innocent people, and then to return to the simple, honest life he had built in the mountains. It wasn't the ending that legends usually had, but it was the ending that brought him peace. And in the end, that was all any man could really ask for.